Welcome to Draw This. I'm artist Aaron Rutten, and in this series of videos, I'm going to randomly select a word and then illustrate it for you in real time while describing my process so that you can follow along. So let's go ahead and get started. So here we go. I'm going to randomly generate a word, and the website I'm going to use today for this is thegamegal.com's word generator, and the word I get is smoke. Now there's a lot of different kinds of smoke, so what I've chosen is cigarette smoke. I'm going to use this kind of general type of smoke here, but I'm going to put it on this stomped out cigarette butt. So I'm going to go ahead and just load my first image in here. And I'm going to make a new layer, call it sketch, take a dark gray color, and I like to use the detail oils brush for this because it looks kind of like a pencil. And I'm going to go ahead and just start sketching. Now, you want to kind of imagine this as being a 3D primitive shape. It's a cylinder, and it starts to get kind of bent. So you can imagine it being maybe a few different cylinders kind of connected together. And there at the end, there's the other opening. And I'll try to kind of put in this filter ring here. I'll just put some indications of the little pattern that's on there. Now, I myself am not a smoker of cigarettes, so I didn't want to do anything that looked pro-smoking. So I thought this was kind of an anti-smoking statement since we're going to do smoke. And I didn't want to just do smoke by itself because it wouldn't be a very detailed video. So I wanted to do something that kind of had a composition and a theme to it, or a story. So since this is on its own layer, go ahead and move it somewhere in the composition to where it's a little more interesting. Maybe this could get used later for something, and if I wanted to, I could use it commercially and put some text up here, put a message up there. So this is kind of a nice rule of thirds composition. So I'm going to turn the sketch down just a little bit so that it's a little more transparent. And I'm going to start creating some new layers. So we'll make sure that our sketch is the topmost layer. And let's call this cigarette. I'm going to use the scratchboard tool and just pick a bright color. It doesn't necessarily have to be the color that I'm going to stick with. And I'm going to just kind of try to fill this in roughly. I'm not going to worry about doing it perfect. And then I'm going to use the pinch tool. Use a pretty good size pinch brush to smooth out these longer lines here. When you get to the end, you probably want to decrease your brush size a little bit. Now I'm going to turn my sketch down just a little bit more so that I can see this better. Whoops, myself. There are lots of other ways that you could get this same shape. You could draw a selection with one of the selection tools and try to manipulate it, but I think this works pretty well. I know it looks like I'm working magic with this pinch tool here and just kind of willing the shape that I want into existence, and in some ways I am. That's kind of how this brush works. It sucks pixels in towards its center, so if you find the magic touch with it, I'm kind of scrubbing back and forth. I'm kind of pinching everything together, you know, maybe like think of it like a Ziploc bag or something. You're kind of squeezing it together, squeezing those pixels together, so it can also suck pixels towards it. And that's kind of what's going on here. That's why it's smoothing out the line. We can also use the distorto brush to just kind of push. And we're not going to need a whole lot of layers here for this. I think this will work for the base layer. I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to get a selection based off of this cigarette layer, so I'm going to right click on it and then do select layer content. Move to the new layer. Let's call this new layer filter. And I'm going to use the scratchboard tool again, pick a color I can see against this red for the filter. Use the distorto to push it into place as much as I need to. I'm going to kind of curve it up and around this corner here so that it looks more three-dimensional. You don't want to do it just flat straight across. It won't look right. Let's create another new layer, keeping that selection active. Let's call this end. This will be the little end here. It's on the cigarette. And for that, we'll use the scratchboard tool. From this perspective, I kind of sketched it in at the wrong angle there because from this perspective, we wouldn't really see the top of the cigarette. So I don't really need that so much to be on its own layer. But since I took the time to make the layer, I'm going to go ahead and just use it. It kind of, I'm trying to look really hard at my reference image here. It kind of curves down that way and then up this way. Something like that. We'll create another new layer. This will be ash, I guess. I don't know what to call the end of it here. This will be the burnt end. And we want to use the scratchboard tool again. It's kind of jagged where it's burnt. Okay. Now we can go ahead and deselect our selection by doing Control D on the keyboard. Create a new layer, move that below all of the other layers, and let's call this debris. This will be all that tobacco that's kind of scattered there. I guess we want kind of a dark reddish brown like that. And for this, I'm going to just experiment here because I don't know exactly what I'm going to use. Let's try this leaf knife here. Usually I use this for leaves, but I have a feeling this might work pretty well for this, which it does. So I'm going to put in some big chunks first. I'm kind of doing these short little taps, short quick little taps. I'm going to make my brush smaller, and I'm trying to stay kind of horizontally when I'm drawing here because I want all this tobacco to look like it's kind of laying flat. They don't all have to go completely horizontal, but most of them I'm going to have kind of going that way. I'll have to change the name of this brush to tobacco knife. It's working so well here. Put a couple of real big pieces in the foreground. We'll kind of blur those a little bit later to make them stand out more. Okay. Just making sure it's real thick in a few spots there. So I think that will work for all of our base layers. We're going to do the smoke last, even though that's what our word is, but don't worry, we'll get to the smoke. Let's start filling these layers in with the right colors. So let's go to the cigarette layer first, turn on preserve transparency. We want to pick an almost white kind of gray color. Typically white and then gray and black will reflect what's around it. This is probably shot on a white background, so it's not really going to reflect any color. So we can go ahead and safely make it kind of gray. You can, it's up to you if you want to make it kind of a warm gray or a cool gray. I think we're going to go with a cool gray because that will contrast better with the kind of orange peach color of the filter. So I'm going to pick just a slightly blue-gray. Use the scratchboard tool again and fill it in there. And let's go to the filter layer, pick kind of peach color for that. I'll go a little bit brighter. And maybe a little bit more orange. Okay. We'll go to that end, which is the little tip there. That's kind of a similar color pretty much. And the tobacco looks good. We'll go back to the cigarette layer and we'll use the scratchboard tool again. So now we will put in some of these lighter colors. This time I'm going to use a warm. I'm just going to kind of paint in some little taps and things like this. This is going to help it look more creased. And I'm going to go with almost white. Put in a few highlights here and there. Sample this darker gray, and I'm going to try to find a gray that's kind of in between. Something like that. I could use the airbrush for this, but I don't want it to look so smooth. So that's why I'm not going to use the airbrush. Let's use the coarse oily blender. I'll just kind of go with the settings that I have here. I'm going to try to avoid blending from outside in, because if you do, you might get some weird effects on your layer there. Let's use the diffuse blur to blend. I'm kind of blending horizontally here, scrubbing back and forth in a few places. And just make sure we get the end there. Zoom out and see how we're looking. We need a little more bright contrast. Let's go ahead and use the digital airbrush here with white. I'm going to use kind of a smaller brush than I usually use because there's some sharp highlights on this. Digital airbrush has a tendency to be kind of smooth. Something like that is looking much better. And although I don't really necessarily see it in the photo, I'll put some kind of reflected light on the other side. Let's just hide our sketch too. That'll help. Okay. Going to do a little bit more work on this. Brighten it a little bit more. Using the same white, but I want to be on the right layer. There we go. Cigarette. Trying to find the right balance in the value here. I think it needs a little bit more shadows. I'm going to use the detail oils. I'm kind of jumping around a lot here, but as you work on this, you start to see more and more detail. And if you don't add enough detail, it's not going to look that realistic. And anybody can draw a cartoon cigarette, and I'm going for something that's maybe slightly more realistic than a cartoon. We'll see what happens here. I'm putting in all these little creases, using that kind of darker gray for the shadows, and then using this white for the highlights. I'm trying to have a good balance of sharp and smooth going on here. Okay, let's blend it a little bit more. Careful not to blend out all of your details. And then let's use the pinch brush. That's going to work really well to make this look like it's got actual creases in it. And I'm going to turn off preserve transparency, and I'm going to use the distorto brush to kind of pull some of these edges around to make it look a little more bent. There we go, that's looking better. Let's go to the filter layer, turn on the preserve transparency feature, and want to keep our shadow on the same side here. So let's just hold Alt on the keyboard and tap to sample this base color. We'll make it darker. Let's try putting in that and see how that works. We want a little darker. That looks pretty good. There's kind of a dent going on here. So I'm going to put that in. Keep kind of sharp contrast on one side and then smooth contrast on the other. That makes it look like a dent. And slightly a little bit of shadow on the other side. That'll help it look more cylindrical. Sample our base color again and let's brighten it. And let's put in a highlight on the opposite side. Where there's that crease, you want to put in a highlight for that. It's kind of starting to come together now. It needs a little bit more shading. There we go. Let's create a selection based on the filter by right-clicking on the filter and then doing select layer content. Let's create a new layer and let's call it pattern. This is going to be the spotty pattern that's on our filter here. Let's use the square chalk brush and let's select a paper that is called polypay wool. And let's do a test and see what we get when we paint. We'll turn off preserve transparency. And we also will want to turn off any color variability. I have some on, so I'm going to turn that off. I'm also going to maybe turn on screen for the composite method. That'll help it blend a little bit better. And here we go. If I paint, I have to turn down the scale. Just kind of hunting here till I find the right pattern. There we go. Something like that. That's kind of what I want. Just some random pattern. Yeah, I like that. Let's create another new layer and let's call it rings. This will be the little lines that go around the filter. We'll use that same color and we'll set the composite method to screen. We'll use the scratchboard tool to draw in some rings. Now we want to try to follow this contour here. Just keep doing undos till I get it right there. Still don't think that looks right. Let's give it another try. Let's just put this in and then we'll smudge it around if we need to. Actually, I think that looks okay. Now this will need some shading so that it looks like it fits. So we'll turn on preserve transparency, pick kind of a dark brown, and use the airbrush. And where that dent is, we want to darken the rings a little bit. And we'll want to darken them where the shadow is on the sides there. That helps it fit in a little bit better. I think maybe we will put the composite method to default real quick and take a look at it. Let's redo this one more time because making it screen makes it blend with that pattern, and that looked kind of weird to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to paint these in again. Try to get them the right color, something like that. And I'll paint that dent back in there again. See if we can find a color that works though. Maybe that's too dark. Maybe we want something like that. There we go. Finding the right color that matches is always important. Okay. Going to do a Control D to deselect. I'm going to go to this end layer, which is this little tip thing that's on here. Let's give this some shading. Let's sample our base color. And let's just make it kind of lighter overall on one end. We'll add some shading to the side that is in shadow. That's helping it come together. I'm going to do some work on our ash end here. No pun intended. Let's put in some dark, warm gray. And we'll use the square chalk. Maybe the settings we have will work. Yep, they do. So you get this nice fractal stuff. Let's select almost black. And we probably are going to have to turn our paper contrast down a little bit. Let's just use the digital airbrush to really fill that in dark first. Okay, back to the square chalk. And you just want there to be a little bit of this dark gray peeking through, not much though. Let's, just for the heck of it, I don't see it in the photo, but I think this will be fun. Let's call this ash 2, I guess, because I can't think of anything else to call it. Let's make this actual little specks of ash. Don't really show up that well, but you know they're there. When we start doing some shading, maybe they'll show up. Try some dark gray too. These are little chunks of light ash that have kind of fallen off. That helps it look more realistic. Let's add a new layer here. Call this tinting. We'll pick a kind of dark reddish brown. Let's make the composite method multiply. Let's use this same brush. I'm going to put in some tinting down here because I see in the reference image there's kind of some warmer brown colors going on. Use the diffuse blur to blend that up. Yeah, that's looking good. Might kind of push it around with the distorto a little bit just to make sure it kind of looks like it's fitting in with these creases here. There we go. Now, I think we can go ahead and we can merge the ash, which is this black tip here. We can merge this with everything all the way down to cigarette. So selected ash, held shift, clicked on cigarette, and then I'm going to do Control E, and then we can rename this cigarette. And I'm going to go to the cigarette layer and let's do some blending with the coarse oily blender. Just kind of want to just lightly tap on this edge to kind of make it look like it's burnt away the paper. Looks nice, and then we can blend it a little bit. You get a little bit of fringe, but that's okay because I don't think that it necessarily hurts for this particular piece. If you find that you get too much fringe and you don't like it, what you can do is you can turn on preserve transparency, take the digital airbrush, select this dark black color that you're using, and then just paint over any of that fringe like that, and then it goes away. Let's zoom out and see how we're looking here. Okay, so what we're going to need is we're going to need a pretty dark background before we can see the smoke, because the smoke is kind of, if it were on a white background like this, you probably wouldn't really be able to see it very well. So we'll go to the canvas layer. That'll just be our background. Let's start with a dark gray and see how that looks. We'll use the paint bucket with current color selected to fill. And I think that's good. Let's give it a little bit of tint towards brown there. Maybe we'll try cool, see how that looks. That's better. Okay, so one thing I see that we need is some shadow under our debris. So we'll create a new layer, call it shadows, turn off preserve transparency. We'll set the composite method to multiply. We can keep using the same dark blue-gray color that we have. And let's use the loaded palette knife. And we'll kind of scrub back and forth horizontally just to put in some shaded area underneath this tobacco debris. Okay, that helps. Let's use the diffuse blur to blend. Just kind of blend horizontally, kind of lightly. Don't really want to blend it too much. And then let's go to the debris layer, turn on preserve transparency. Let's put in some darker colors. Let's use that same loaded palette knife. Now I'm doing kind of, I'll show you what I'm drawing. I'll draw it bigger. I'm doing some kind of strokes like that. Trying to make this look like it's got some layering to it. I'll probably go with almost black here. There are some pretty dark areas in this tobacco in the reference image. As of right now, it's kind of too light in the version I have. And let's put in some lighter areas. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Let's go to this ash 2 layer. This is that ash that we put in, and let's blend that a little bit because it's not looking exactly like I wanted it to. So I'm just doing some horizontal blending. I think that does kind of give a feel of the ash though, so I'm going to keep it. I like it. Now let's do what we were going to do initially and start adding the smoke. I think I see one more thing though. I'm going to right click on cigarette, do select layer content, create a new layer, call it texture, pick a kind of dark gray brown like this, set the composite method to multiply. You can't do without the texture. Texture really helps this to look proper. We'll do a Control D to deselect. I'm going to turn down the opacity. That's what this was missing. There we go. Now we're looking good. Add another layer. I know I'm just doing everything to avoid doing this smoke. I really should have just called this video cigarette because I'm spending so much time on that, but we're giving our piece of context here. I'm going to pick a light color because I feel like this needs a little bit more highlights on it in a few places. A couple little fine lines up here. And let's get our selection back from our cigarette so that our highlights don't go off of the cigarette there. That looks good. That really helps it look three-dimensional. I'm going to do that a little bit with the white part too. There we go. Now it's coming together. It wasn't looking right to me to begin with there. Okay, I promise we really will do smoke. Okay, now we're really going to do smoke. I swear. Create a new layer. I'm going to call it smoke. And I'm going to pull up my other reference image now so that we can look at that. So this is probably going to want to be a screen composite method. And let's just group our cigarette. So let's look in the palette knives here. Let's do palette knife. Let's see what we get initially here. I'm going to do a Control D to make sure I don't have any selections active. Okay, so normally the palette knife works like this. If we go into the advanced brush controls and we go to angle, so if you set your expression to direction in the angle, then you get something like this, which I feel looks a lot like this kind of effect that you get here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to come out pretty straight initially from a cigarette, but then when I get up here, this is when it's going to start to kind of go crazy. You might have to keep making your brush a little bit bigger as you go along. I have a couple little doodads that come off of there. So that looks a lot like smoke to me. Some that kind of curls. There's always that kind of curling action there. Yes. This is really working. I hadn't tried this ahead of time, so I really am just doing these off the cuff. Oh, another kind of curl there. Okay. So obviously we don't want it to be that white. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to tone it down a little bit. Let's go ahead and use the digital airbrush for this. So what I'm doing is I'm painting with black, and what that's doing is it is kind of just concealing or almost erasing that white. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to get some dimensionality to this so it looks like it's kind of layers of smoke. So I'm trying to follow the contours that are already there. So I'm painting in the direction of the smoke rather than doing anything that would disrupt it. Okay. Let's turn down the opacity a little bit until we get something that's a little more subtle. And let's blend it using the diffuse blur. We want to make sure that we blur, I'll have to turn off preserve transparency. We have to make sure that we blur and we blend with the smoke, with the direction that everything's going, and try to blend kind of lightly. at the top, it can kind of look like it's just fading out, so you can feel free to just kind of blend it more there, but everywhere else you kind of want it to just get a little fuzzy but not really get destroyed. And then now what we can do is we can use the pinch brush to pinch it into a kind of thin point here, so it looks like it's coming off of the cigarette. And then here and there you can just kind of use this to kind of pinch this smoke. That helps it look a little more natural. You could use the distorto too if you want to just kind of push it like the wind. Helps it look a little more natural. Maybe I'm doing that too much. I want to overdo it here. I'm going to blend it a little bit more towards the bottom so that it doesn't quite connect there. Okay, so let's add some more detail to our background. We'll go ahead and just use black and use the airbrush. Let's kind of vignette the foreground using the airbrush to kind of make this gradient here. Maybe we'll vignette the top too and see how that looks. Yeah, that helps the smoke really stand out. Maybe we'll just vignette the whole thing. Why not? Now we're really putting the focus on that cigarette there. Let's go to the cigarette layer. Still don't know if I'm sold on this ash 2 layer. This is a lesson in experimenting and then not being happy and then trying something new. So I'm just going to do a Control A to select all, hit delete to delete that, do Control D to deselect. I think the tobacco looks pretty good, but the ash was not looking good, so I'm going to redo that. I'm going to take the square chalk brush, and I'm going to do another attempt at putting in some little ash specks. I might have to just try to make them smaller with a smaller brush, because at this scale they would be pretty big chunks. Okay, turn on preserve transparency and add some just dark areas to some of those. And then let's go to the debris layer and let's make a selection of that by right-clicking on it and doing select layer content, turn off preserve transparency, create a new layer, just call this texture 2, hide the selection with Control Shift H, use the sponge and black to paint some texture over this tobacco. So it has some texture. We'll turn down the opacity. Set the composite method to multiply as well. That'll just help it blend better. We'll zoom out and we'll see how we're looking here. Now I think what we want is to maybe blend a little bit of this debris, because I might have gone too heavy on it. So I want to knock it back a little bit. I'm going to use the coarse oily blender, make sure I don't have any selections active by doing Control D, and I'm going to push this so it kind of looks like it's emanating more from the tip. It's causing this fringe here, which I always hate the fringe, but it can be fixed. It's not the end of the world. So here's how we fix it. We zoom in so we can see it pretty well. We take the distorto brush, turn on preserve transparency, and then just push it away. I'll have to know which direction to go to push it away properly. You want to go from inside the object outside the canvas. You want to try not to push in from outside of the canvas in, because you'll just push in more white and you'll just make everything worse. If you find you're battling too much with it, you can also just select the digital airbrush, select that brown, and then just paint in that brown all along the edges too. That might be more efficient than trying to use the distorto. In this case, I think it is. One day, Painter won't have this fringe problem. Doesn't happen in Photoshop, but it happens in Painter, and it drives me crazy because I always have to figure out how to get rid of it or try to prevent it. So now the tobacco looks like it's kind of getting smashed out of the end of the cigarette. So we can go ahead and put the finishing touches on this now. I'm going to do a layers drop all. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, and let's put some focal blurring on it. So let's use the blur brush. I'm going to blur the sides of the cigarette so that they're not so sharp. Blend that tip there so that blends in. Sometimes your digital art can be too sharp. Things aren't this sharp in real life when you look at them. Things are usually more blurry because your eyes don't focus so sharply on every part of an object. So if you can take focus away by doing these blurs, you're going to make it look more natural because it's going to look more realistic optically. So I'm using a really big brush now for this blur. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to blur most of what's in the foreground, drawing focus into here. I'm going to use the diffuse blur to blur kind of in the direction that this cigarette is going, just on the filter part. Do a couple little blends there. And I'm not so happy with the end of this, so I'm going to use the distorto to push this into the shape that I think that I might like better. See how you can make all these changes even after the fact when you think you're almost done. And if you wanted to, you could try to reshape the whole thing as much as you want. This is helping it look more creased and smashed, though, the more I mess with it. But you can mess with things too much and just make them look worse, so you have to watch out for that too. Trying to make the end look more frayed there. One thing that I do want to mention, because I wanted this to be more about smoke and it ended up being more about the cigarette, there's also the hurricane and turbulence brushes, and let's play with those because let's see what they do to the smoke. So you get these cool, I should have shown you this earlier, get these cool effects where it kind of twirls things around. You don't want to go too nuts with that though. The turbulence kind of does something similar, so maybe I'll use some of that there. And of course we want to blur it and blend it again because now it's too sharp. We use the blur just to maybe blur some more of that smoke too, because that doesn't need to be super sharp. Okay, so I'm going to zoom out and just give it a once over to see if I like how it looks. Since we have just a tiny bit more time left, let's just do something to make this a little more dramatic of a composition. Let's create a new layer, turn off preserve transparency. Let's select multiply for the composite method. And let's play around with doing some sort of tint over this to see if it kind of helps it look a little more moody. I think that does help a little bit. Here's with, here's without. think it helps a little bit to make it more interesting. Alright, so there you go. We have a finished painting, and now you know how to make smoke. If you found this information helpful, take a quick second to like this video and share it on YouTube and on Facebook, and that'll make it easier for other artists out there to find this information. And remember to stay tuned for new episodes of Draw This every Tuesday.